to itself. But the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle, despite having some weak correlation in terms of their duration or their so-called periodicity, no pun intended, well, there's no causal relationship whatsoever between the lunar cycle and the menstrual cycle. If any of you are aware of any real data that conflict with what I just said, please put that in the comment section on YouTube. But this is pretty well established as far as I know. Okay, so we need to bring together the so-called haploid contents, the 23 individual strands of chromosomes from the egg, to a place in a position where it could potentially be fertilized by the male. So what happens? Luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone travel to the ovary. These hormones are able to access the ovary. There's a lot of blood supply to the ovary. And FSH and LH arrive at the ovary. The ovary has this vault, this ovarian reserve of immature cells. They reside within what are called follicles. The follicles are little spherical packages that can potentially provide a nice environment for those eggs to mature. And when FSH in particular arrives at the ovary, a small number of those follicles will split off from the reserve. They will exit the vault and they will undergo maturation. And the key player here is follicle stimulating hormone. And the first 14 days of the menstrual ovulatory cycle is referred to as the follicular phase because of this relationship between FSH triggering the maturation of a subset of follicles. Now, typically in the context of a 28-day or so ovulatory menstrual cycle, day 1 is designated as the first day of the period, of the shedding of the uterine lining from the previous ovulatory menstrual cycle in which fertilization did not occur. Okay? So day 1 is when the period initiates. It is days 1 through 14 approximately, right? Because here we're just considering the average of a 28-day cycle, but it could be longer, it could be shorter. But the first half of that cycle is the so-called follicular phase. FSH has triggered the departure of a subset of these follicles that contain immature eggs, and it is triggering the maturation of those eggs. Luteinizing hormone is also present, but also at relatively low levels. And it's during the first half of this ovulatory menstrual cycle that the main goal is to get those follicles to mature. So inside of those follicles, the egg is developing, it's growing, it's maturing. And in doing so, it's also making its own hormones. This, I think, is one of the most elegant aspects of the ovulatory menstrual cycle, that in a few minutes, you'll learn about something which still to this day, even though I've known about this stuff for decades now because of my training, still just blows my mind that you have one hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, triggering the maturation of some eggs inside of some follicles, and then those follicles themselves making another hormone that furthers the process, and then soon, as you'll learn, create a hormone to trigger the second half of the process. Just a beautiful symphony of expression of different genes and different hormones to make everything work as optimally as possible. So as these different follicles mature, somehow, and we still don't know exactly how, one of those follicles containing an egg gets selected. It's either because it matures the fastest or there's something about it that is still not completely understood that allows it to be selected, and all the other follicles that are maturing degenerate and die. And they're gone. They don't go back into the ovarian reserve. They are now depleted from that bank account that is the ovarian reserve. They die off, but that single egg that, keep in mind, contains 23 pairs of chromosomes, right? We haven't gotten rid of one half of those 23 sets of chromosomes yet, but that one will continue to mature. And then at some point, that egg will start to undergo a process in which those chromosomes are pulled apart by little components within the egg called spindles. They literally have a physical pulling of the chromosomes apart. So now those 23 pairs are no longer attached to one another at the middle like they were before, like two beads of strings, or I should say 23 short strands of beads that were at once connected to one another now are pulled apart so that you have 23 chromosomes on each side, but they're pulled apart from one another, right? So that diploid cell is now starting to become a cell in which half of the chromosomes, half of those 23 pairs, are physically pulled away from the others. And then the egg actually starts to form its own, what we call an involution, a membrane around those 23 pairs, one set of them, and encapsulates them. So you've sort of got an egg with two parts where the two sets of chromosomes, two sets of 23 chromosomes are now separate from one another inside of the egg. And then one of those actually gets ejected from the egg. And the name of that thing that gets ejected, it's sort of like the little hovel pod, is how I imagine it, from Star Wars, or from any kind of space odyssey movie where something is ready to happen, the little hovel pod shoots out of the ship. Well, that 23 pairs is now ejected from the egg. It's called the polar body, and that's going to degenerate. It's going to go away. And in doing so, take the egg cell, which was once diploid, it had 23 pairs of chromosomes, and making it haploid. And now what you've got in ideal circumstances is a beautifully pristine egg that was selected for and has 23 single strands of chromosomes, 22 autosomes and one sex chromosome. And that sex chromosome is going to be an X chromosome almost with certainty because female mother is creating that egg. So then the egg that contains just the appropriate 23 single-stranded chromosomes is going to fuse with the wall of the ovary, and that egg will be released and will travel into the fallopian tube. Now, we'll get back to that egg in a few moments, but that process, which represents the first half of the ovulatory menstrual cycle, again, was triggered by FSH and to some extent luteinizing hormone. But it is the ongoing maturation of that egg, which also causes the production of estrogen, which allows that whole process to occur. And you could say, why? Well, the answer to the why is a very important biological principle that we are going to return to in a number of different contexts today, both as reference to female and male fertility. And the principle is a so-called negative feedback. So when estrogen is present at relatively low levels in females in the ovary, as it is during the development of these eggs, some of that estrogen, of course, is going to exit the ovary. It's going to go into the bloodstream, and it's going to travel back to the pituitary. Now, the pituitary can release things like follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. But the way I'd like you to think about the pituitary for sake of feedback loops is that it's sort of like a thermometer that you would put into a pool, like a backyard pool, that is attached to the heater. And for instance, if you were to put a thermometer into a pool that you would like to keep at 70 degrees, and the temperature of that pool is 60 degrees, well, then that thermometer ought to trigger some sort of mechanism where the pool would heat up until the temperature of the pool hit 70 degrees, and then it should trigger that thermometer to turn off the heating system. Okay, that's kind of a negative feedback system that would keep the temperature more or less correct. That's a lot of the way that the systems related to estrogen and also testosterone and these different things like luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone work as well. Typically, when the level of a hormone is too high, then it shuts down the production of the hormones that would trigger further production of that hormone. I know that's a mouthful. It's a lot to think about. And some of you are probably thinking, whoa, I'm getting dizzy now with biology. But I promise you can understand this. In females, when estrogen is relatively low, but not zero, but is relatively low during that first follicular half of the ovulatory cycle, it actually triggers negative feedback on LH and FSH so that not too much is produced. But then just prior to ovulation, the levels of estrogen and the levels of some other hormones from those eggs, right? You have the eggs producing estrogen themselves, gets high enough that it actually triggers a positive feedback loop on the pituitary. So the pituitary is essentially observing the amount of estrogen in the bloodstream produced by the ovary, and the amount of estrogen towards the end of the second half of the menstrual cycle has increased and triggers a positive feedback loop. It triggers the pituitary to release more FSH and LH, and that helps trigger ovulation. Okay, that deployment or the release of that one mature, proper, selected egg that's haploid with the 23 individual pairs of chromosomes into the fallopian tube. So let's just back up really quickly and just kind of summarize what's happened. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus triggers the release of follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That travels to the ovary, triggers the release of a subset of immature follicles with immature eggs. Those immature follicles and immature eggs start to mature, start to grow because of the presence of follicle-stimulating hormone. The growth of those eggs themselves increases estrogen. As the estrogen starts to accumulate in the environment, some of that travels back